Good evening, everybody, and hi. Great to see you all here. I'm Joran from Joranalogue Collide Design, all the way from Belgium. Happy to be in Scotland for the first time. Already had some haggis, so started off good. Yeah, thank you to the Signal Sounds crew for having me. So for the people who are not familiar with our series of Eurorack modules, Joranalogue Audio Design is all about our passion for analog circuits. So all of the modules are fully analog, really modern, fully featured, and we like to take things as far as we can and then say, okay, this is as far as we can take analog. It's good, and go and have some fun with it and play with it. So today we're gonna explore one module in particular, and I'm very professional. I have a laser pointer, so so welcome to my corporate presentation. We're gonna synergize tonight, so get ready, guys. We've got here on the screen the diagram we made to explain Collide 4, because it's our most complex, our most fully featured module so far. And it's a collaboration with Hainbach, who I'm sure you're all familiar with from the internet. And it's a module that's based on lock-in amplifier. And that is something which has been used in, and still is being used in, physics departments all around the world for complicated physics stuff. But the cool thing is that a lock-in amplifier is actually a kind of synthesizer, and we're going to be exploring that over the course of the next couple of hours. How you can use something that was originally designed for physics research in a musical way. So we're listening now to Collide 4 droning about. And Collide 4 consists of a number of parts. We've got the input section, we've got an oscillator, we've got a detector, and then we've got an output section as well with some analog computing goodness going on. And all of these parts together, they form a kind of synth voice, a complex oscillator, a signal processor. So it's a very versatile module. And the cool thing is that to understand Collide 4, actually if you understand classic analog subtractive synthesis with a VCO and a VCF in a VCA, it's not so difficult to understand Collide 4 because it consists of many of the parts you already know. So it's got a preamp, it's got a filter, it's got VCA, it's got a quadrature oscillator. So these are all parts that anyone with a bit of experience in modular already knows, but arranged in a very different way. So it's the architecture, the way these parts are interconnected, that's unique, that's different, and that gives Collide 4 a very different sound palette from, let's say, a normal standard subtractive voice. So I'm going to turn this up a little bit. What we are doing here is just using the input section. So if we can have the diagram back. All right. The input section, it consists of a preamp, a variable bandwidth filter. So that's a bandpass filter with variable bandwidth. So you can see it here on this diagram. You can change the center frequency, like normal center frequency of a bandpass. You can move that about. But you also have here this width control. So you can change the bandwidth, make it wide or make it very narrow. And of course, you can also add a resonance on top. So you can have a resonant peak going all the way up to the ceiling there. What we're doing in this patch is we are pinging the filter, and pinging a filter just means putting a little trigger through it. And I'm going to make that clearer for you to hear. So this is just a standard filter ping. How can we do this? Well, we've got a ping generator. Normally, to do filter ping sounds, you would have, for example, a really short envelope generator. You make a little transient. You put it through a filter with a resonance just below the point of self-oscillation. And then you get this nice natural decay of the resonance, a lot like you throw a little pebble into a pond and it gives these waves that decay naturally. So this is how we use Collide 4 as a synth voice. We don't have an envelope generator in the module, but we can ping the filter and that creates a decayed sound naturally. This ping generator helps with creating these ping sounds simply by generating this little transient automatically from any kind of gate or trigger source. So in this patch, I'm just using contour 1. The output goes into the ping generator, but it doesn't really matter what you put in. It's gonna detect the transient and then create out of that a perfect transient for pinging the filter. Then I've got the resonance just below self-oscillation, but of course I can turn up the resonance, turn off the preamp, and now we have sustained oscillation, and we have a very nice sine wave oscillator here. So the filter will self-oscillate, it will track fault per octave, temperature stable, you can use it as an oscillator. But let's go back to pinging it. So we get these nice natural filter pings. Now we have the filter gain knob as well. And if we go back to the diagram, you can see that following the preamp and the filter, we also have a filter gain VCA. So that's a VCA, voltage controlled amplifier, that's specifically set up for amplifying, because most VCAs and synths, we use them to attenuate. This one is designed to amplify. And we control that with the filter gain knob. So if I turn that up, we increase the gain and we push the ping sound into clipping on purpose. Because it turns out that these vintage lock-in amplifiers, which Mr. Hainbach likes to use musically, they distort beautifully. So we recreated that in Collide 4, but we made it voltage controlled. We can turn down the frequency of the filter. And now we get these typical lock-in sounds, let's say. And this is achieved by pinging the filter and then turning up the post-filter gain. And what you get is the sine wave being clipped into square waves at the beginning, and then it decays down back into a sine wave. So you get a very natural decay in harmonics as well, because you start off very clipped, very squarish, and then it decays down into a sine wave. So we get a sound that's not too dissimilar to a filter being enveloped. With the cutoff, a low-pass filter being enveloped, with the cutoff going down, we get high harmonics in the beginning, low harmonics at the end. So you're already starting to see the parallels with subtractive synthesis, but it's not subtractive synthesis. And this filter gain knob will go up to 60 dB, so it smashes. And of course you can play with the resonance. And we can make a little sequence maybe. Oh, that's very low. So now I'll patch the contour 1 into the step inputs of step 8. And then that is way too low, so I'm gonna speed it up a bit. So you get these very nice, crisp filter pings. You can also change the preamp gain. with this rotary switch on the top left. If you go to the diagram, remember that the preamp comes before the filter. So what happens here is that the pings from the ping generator, you can also amplify or attenuate those in 10 dB steps. And that's going to change the transient of the pings. So every setting has its own timbre. And that also goes simply off, and then you don't get any pings going in. And then I can turn up the post-filter gain again. This is completely unquantized, of course. So that's a very quick overview of the input section. We of course have the level and overload light, which there's a little story associated with that. So on the vintage lock-in amplifiers, which are devices, I didn't bring any today because taking that on the train is not very practical. These things are like 20 kilos, 19-inch rack mount units, designed for, you install it in a physics lab and you don't touch it for 30 years. On these things, you get these nice overload lights, because it's important when you're doing a measurement, a physics measurement, that you don't have any overloads, because then you know your measurement is going to be wrong. Here things are a little bit different. Clipping sounds good on Collide 4, so the moment it pushes into clipping, you can see the light going red. And otherwise it lights up white and shows you the signal level at the output of the input section. So it looks nice, but it's also very useful, and this was one of the must-have features which were mandated by Hainbach himself, that red overload LED. And then for the rest on the input section, well, we have, if you go back to the diagram, we have inputs, of course. So far we haven't used them, but you have the signal inputs. These are differential. One is minus, the other is plus. So that easiest way to think of that is that you have two inputs being mixed together, but one is out of phase, one is inverted. So you can do some interesting phase cancellation tricks there. Or you can have two completely uncorrelated signals. Then it doesn't matter, they're just mixed together. So useful to have. That's on the bottom left of the module. You've got a ping input above that. And then we've got voltage control over everything. So you've got your voltage controlled post filter, VCA gain with the knob as well to set the modulation depth. You've got voltage controlled center, bandwidth, you've got resonance, everything voltage controlled. And then the monitor output here is your dedicated output of the input section. So far, we've only been using this much of the module, and the monitor output gives you dedicated outputs of that section. And this input section, you can basically look at it as a module on its own, as a preamp, a filter, and an output clipping VCA. Already very useful building block to use on its own. And that's another thing that I think is important to understand about Collide 4. If you go back to the diagram, this looks very complicated, but you can actually look at these different sections as useful modular building blocks. You can actually patch up different things with, and you can use separately within a patch. So instead of looking at Collide 4 as a big synth voice, maybe in some patch, you want to do some filtering and clipping, and then you also need an oscillator, and you also need some ring modulators. So you can use those different parts that are in there separately, and that's for me really the strength of modular synthesis of patch programming, is having these different very universal building blocks available. Okay, so that's the input section. Of course, we can process some external sound through there as well. So I can, if I just repatch a little bit, I can use cycle 5, which is our new small oscillator. So now I'm using one of the inputs, and I've got cycle 5 in there. I'm just going to change the sequence a little bit. You can have different wave shapes going into the input of Collide 4. And now we can just listen to the preamp, those 10 dB steps. We can filter. Make the bandwidth really narrow, add some resonance on there. We can push the pre-amplifier into amplification, so we get pre-filter distortion. Can add some extra harmonics for the filter to bite on. Maybe have a sine wave going in there, clip that into the inputs. And of course we also have the post-filter clipping if you turn up the filter gain. And can get pretty... There's some life in this module. And of course we can modulate these together, so I could for example, go through multiples here, take the same sequence into the oscillator, and then patch that into the center CV as well. So now the filter is tracking the external oscillator. Okay, that's a quick overview of the input section. As I said, very capable little modular building block on its own. Now there's one control we didn't talk about, and that's the free and track switch. And that has to do with the oscillator in Collide 4. So if we go back to the diagram, you see that you don't just have this self-oscillating filter in there, but you've also got a dedicated true zero quadrature VCO. What does true zero means? It means that it can modulate true zero, so you've got linear frequency modulation that can actually go into negative frequencies, which just means that the oscillator starts going the other direction. In practice, that means that you can do really nice and deep linear frequency modulation. And then quadrature, that means that you have not just one, but two outputs, a sine and a cosine. And you can see that on a little diagram here. They're both sinusoidal, but you've got a 90-degree phase difference, which enables some really neat tricks, which we'll get to later. And this is also, leads to the name of the module, which is a quadrature spectral computer. So we didn't just say, oh, it's a lock-in amplifier brought into Eurorack, but it's actually more. It can do a lot more than these vintage lock-in amplifiers could ever hope to achieve. And that's why we gave it a name that also reflects all of these additional capabilities it has. And a lot of that is based on this quadrature topology. So we've got, and we'll go into the details a little bit later, but we've got 2 signal paths here in quadrature with this 90-degree phase difference that leads to this X prime and Y prime output. And that's something you don't find on the vintage stuff, which would only have one of these signal paths. And that creates beautiful capabilities in stereo, which is leads me to another little story. When I got the first prototype into Hainbach's hands in his studio, one of the first things he said that was that first of all, this was the first time that he heard a lock-in amplifier in stereo, because it's not possible with the vintage stuff. And also he has a collection of several different vintage lock-in amplifiers in different formats. Some of them are in this really interesting, it's like a nuclear version of Eurorack, which is kind of amazing. And then also like the really big standalone rack mount ones. He's got several different types because they all have their own particularities, they all have their own sound. The interesting thing about Collide 4 is because it is so much more, it's so much more expanded compared to those things, that you end up covering a lot of the timbral ground that these old units have. And his conclusion was that he can basically replace all or most of that stuff with just Collide 4. Hence why, if you have seen his more recent module, he ended up putting 4 in a rack, and they all have their own, he can use them all in different ways simultaneously. And yeah, a lot of that has to do with how many outputs you have on Collide 4, how many capabilities you have, and also all of the CV control, which is another thing you will not find on the vintage stuff. You may have like CV input for frequency of the oscillator, but on Collide 4 you get a CV input for every parameter, which also means that you can do feedback patching, you can do subtle modulations of things, and that expands the sonic palette incredibly. Can't do that with any of the vintage stuff. So if you go back to the diagram, that was our input section. We've got this monitor output. And why is it called monitor? It's because it allows you to monitor your pre-processed signal before you do all of the other processing to it. So that's a label you find on vintage lock-in amps. And we've kept that because Collide 4 is a real lock-in amplifier. It's just disguised as a Eurorack module. The oscillator and detector section here. So here we find this dedicated oscillator with the sine and the cosine outputs. We can give that a listen. So on the almost top right-hand side of the module, we've got the oscillator I and the oscillator Q outputs. That stands for in phase and quadrature. So we're just listening to the sine now, and it's just simple sine oscillator, really nice one, but nothing special on its own. We can modulate it. So let's do that with the volt proctive inputs. And it will play, if you have a quantized sequence, it will play volt proctive very well, just like the filter does with temperature compensation. Now we have, let's grab another cable here. We have this Q output, so we can listen in stereo. And depending on where you are sitting in the room, you might be getting some interesting stereo field here, because what's happening now is that we have a 90-degree phase difference between left and right, which I have to say is sounding quite funky from where I am, but I'm behind the speakers, so probably has something to do with it. And then we can introduce some modulation to this. So we're going to be using Collide 4 as a complex oscillator now, because remember that in this input section we have a filter that can self-oscillate. So we can set it to self-oscillate. I'll turn down the gain. We get the sine wave out of it. And then I take the monitor output, which is our sine wave. And if you don't believe me, we can listen to it. It's a sine wave. Oh, and it's set to tracking, which brings me back to what I was saying previously, this switch. If it's set to track, the filter will track the oscillator. So that means that one volt-proct of input is modulating both the filter and the oscillator together. So that's why when we listen to the filter, it's playing the same sequence as the oscillator. If you set this to free, it's completely independent. Okay, so we listen to our stereo outputs of the oscillator, and then I put the monitor outputs, our filter sine wave, into the frequency modulation inputs. And now you start to hear frequency modulation. I'll remove the sequence, just to get a steady tone out of there. So you might be getting some interesting stereo frequency modulation sounds. And this is how you can use Collide 4 as a stereo complex oscillator, and you get these really interesting stereo warbles. I love this. But remember, we can sequence this. And with the tracking, both our modulator and our carrier, because we've created a modulator carrier pair, both of them are being sequenced together. Can change the resonance. And of course I can shape the modulator into a square wave by turning on the filter gain. So yeah, already a very powerful combination there. And that's just the oscillator. Of course, oscillator also has exponential FM, so we can have a listen to that. Just in mono. Remove the sequence, and I'll take our self-oscillating filter into the exponential inputs. And then same thing here, we have modulation depth. That's quite low. Let's turn it up. And of course, in this case, you're going to get, and I'm going to turn off the tracking as well, so they're independent, more clear to hear. That's a classic exponential FM sweep. But there you will hear that you get this perceived pitch shift, which is normal with exponential FM. If we do the same with the linear FM, we get this perceived pitch staying constant. Okay, so that's the modulation side of the oscillator, and then we also have a symmetry control. So with anyone familiar with true zero oscillators, you might also be familiar with the symmetry knob. That basically sets the 0 point around which you modulate. So if it's set into the center, the oscillator will essentially stop, go to 0 Hertz, and then you're modulating into the positive frequency realm, into the negative frequency realm, depending on how far, depends on how strong your modulation signal is, your true zero modulation signal coming in. If you set it higher, you get a constant tone, and then you can modulate above or below, and potentially through zero if you modulate low enough. So this essentially sets your reference points, and of course it also affects the pitch because you get 0 Hertz in the middle. We can hear the difference there if we patch in the modulation again. Turn it on. Does it have moderate symmetry or maybe all the way up? If we go down, that's there we go. This is symmetrical to 0 FM. Oh, let's listen to that in stereo. Yeah, that's fun. And of course, if we turn up the symmetry control, we get a very different type of linear FM. Okay, so that's the oscillator. Now, if we go back to the diagram, the oscillator is just a little part of the module. So on the block diagram, it's this little block with the I and the Q outputs. It has quite a few front panel controls and the 2 dedicated outputs. But the real magic in Collide 4 lies in everything that's around it, this Hilbert transform network, the 2 ring modulators or balanced modulators, as we also call them. There's a couple of extra filters there. And that creates our detection. And this brings us back to what actually is a lock-in amplifier. Why should you care? Well, the thing here is that a lock-in amplifier is a device that's designed for detecting really weak signals, for example, from a sensor hooked up to a particle accelerator, amplifying them, which we're doing here in the input section with the preamplifier. So you're amplifying them, you're filtering them, you're getting rid of all the frequencies you definitely are not interested in. You're amplifying again, we've got that in the filter gain VCA. And then you have a signal that has most of the stuff you're not interested in, but it might have a signal that's buried way into the noise. You can still lock into that one specific frequency and measure how much of that frequency, how much signal there actually is. And that's what all of this does. Now, do you need to understand the signal processing theory of how a lock-in amplifier manages to do this? Do you need to go out and buy a lab coat before you can use Collide 4? No, definitely not, and I hope I can demonstrate that here tonight. But I do think it's very interesting to actually understand what's in Collide 4, why it has all of these things, why they're connected this way, and how you would use it in its original application, because it does give you a deeper understanding of the module itself and what it can do. So we have something we call the detector, and this does the whole lock-in amplifier process. And it's based on a very simple idea, very simple phenomenon you get with ring modulation. It's this very simple idea that if you take a signal, frequency, and you amplify it with itself, and remember, a ring modulator is just an amplifier amplifying 2 signals. If you amplify it with itself, you get the same signal, twice the frequency, and it has a DC shift. I'm not going to go into the mathematics tonight. But the interesting thing is that this DC shift, if you measure that, you know exactly how much signal there was to begin with. Because you know on one side, you know your oscillator, you know exactly how strong that oscillator is. So that's one side of your multiplication. And then the other side is your signal from whatever, some sensor, some experiment, pre-processed, goes into here, the other side of this ring modulator. So you can actually measure how much signal exists here at X at frequency set by the oscillator at I here. Then you have a filter that gets rid of all the high frequency stuff. So only DC is left in the original lock-in amplifier application. And then at the output here, you would get a DC signal that's shown on the nice panel meter you get on the vintage stuff. And that needle is actually telling you, okay, at exactly the frequency set by the oscillator and the phase as well, because this is phase dependent. It shows you exactly how much signal there is. So you can actually have, for example, you have some signal going into an optical experiment. You know exactly how strong the laser is pointing into that experiment. You have a sensor on the other side, and you can detect how much light is let through at a specific frequency. Is this interesting, or is this important when you're making music? No. It's important because it happens to sound good. And this is the cool part. These lock-in amplifier instruments were never designed for making music, and yet they resemble synthesizers so well that it's almost uncanny. And we have to thank not just Hainbach, but also Robin Verschoor from Rotterdam for finding these instruments, finding musical application in these instruments. And to take it even further, this goes back to the earliest days of electronic music, where synthesizers did not exist. There was a time where all of this stuff didn't exist. And the earliest pioneers started making music with whatever they could get. Radio stuff, electronics test gear, tape stuff. And this also, these lock-in amplifiers, they weren't really used back then because it was way too expensive. This was, locked into physics departments. But the idea of using something that was never designed for making music and finding musical application in it is actually very, very creatively rewarding, at least I think. And Hainbach happens to agree with that. So we found each other in that. So that was a lot of talking, so let's listen to it. We've got ring modulation of our oscillator and our filter, so we can hear some ring modulation tones. And to do that, we can use the X prime and Y prime outputs. Turn it up. So, classic, very much early electronic music vibes with the ring modulation there. And again, this is the filter and self-oscillation and our dedicated oscillator together. Stereo ring modulation, pretty cool. Turn up the filter gain. And our oscillator also has a frequency range switch. So now it's set to audio range. We can go into low range and use the oscillator to do a kind of auto panning to our self-oscillating filter. Change the rate of the oscillator. And it will dip into the audio range, so you can get some really nice beating effects. And we have a fine control on the oscillator as well to fine-tune the frequency. And remember that this input section can process any signal, so you can use Collide 4 as an auto panner on any external signal as well. And another nice trick is that you can still use this tracking feature even when the oscillator is set to the low frequency range. You get this very interesting spaceship-like sounds. So I like to think that there's some application here for sci-fi movie sound design as well. Okay, so that's some ring modulation in stereo because we have the two ring modulators. If you go to the diagram, we've got the two ring modulators and we were listening to both of those, X prime in the left channel and Y prime in the right channel. And then we've also got a low-pass filter on each of those because in the original scientific lock-in amplifier application, we use those to filter all the way down to DC. In our practical musical application, these filters can simply filter in the audio range. So let's listen to that. And go back up. So we've got something with a lot of harmonics, and we can simply filter some of those out. So these are simple two-pole, non-resonant, low-pass filters, both controlled together by the time constant knob. Why is it called time constant? Because that's how it's called on the vintage lock-in amplifiers. And basically it sets the time constant of your measurement. So if it's set really slow, your measurement is more exact, but also slower to respond to changes. If you set it really fast, it will respond really fast. On these vintage units, you get these huge rotary switches, which have a massive range. On Collide 4, we've made something that's a lot more appealing for musical use. Continuous knob, you can sweep all the way through the audio range, but you can still put it into low range and actually filter down to DC and in theory use Collide 4 as a real lock-in amplifier for your next particle accelerator projects. If you happen to have one in your shed. Now, there's more, because there's always more. There's the Hilbert transform network. And now we are venturing beyond the lock-in amplifiers. We've already ventured a little bit beyond because we have this quadrature, the X prime and the Y prime, remember? I said that the vintage ones don't have this, but the modern digital ones do. More about that later. But this Hilbert transform network is also known, it's a kind of sub-circuit also known as a dome filter. And this is something you would find in frequency shifters. Now, the frequency shifter is not a lock-in amplifier, but as I was researching lock-in amplifiers and seeing how can we turn this into a modern Eurorack module, I realized that this quadrature topology is actually very similar to a frequency shifter. And frequency shifters is, it's this kind of effect that's been around for a long time as well, really a staple of like early electronic music as well. So I thought, okay, how crazy would it be if we can make one module that's both a lock-in amplifier and the frequency shifter? Turns out it's pretty crazy, but we did it. So we have in Collide 4 a dedicated Hilbert transform network. What does that do? Well, it just takes a signal that's coming in and it spits out two versions that are 90-degree separated. They sound the same, but you get a 90-degree phase difference between them. What happens if you then multiply one of them with a sine wave, you multiply the other with a cosine, and then you take the sum and the difference of those two? Well, you get frequency shifting. And that's why we have on the output section here, we have a sum and difference network, which just means that you get the difference of x, the difference between x prime and y prime, and you get the sum of the two. So actually very simple. But these two outputs, they do the frequency shifting. So let's see if we can listen to that. So to enable this, we have a dedicated switch on the top right of the module. The X is Y or delta 90 degree switch. And then if everything is set up right, probably need a bit more gain. Ooh. Might be some feedback going on here. Okay. Okay. Test. Let's see if we can go down here. Yes, that's a little bit better. Okay, so now we have a little bit less gain. Good. So I'm just taking this microphone into receive 2, giving it some gain, goes into the input section of Collide 4, set pretty neutrally, and then that goes through all of the detector stuff we saw on the diagram before. And my voice is being multiplied by the oscillator. Then if I change the frequency of the oscillator, I can make myself sound like this. Or I can go the other way, and I can make myself sound like this. So a really nice trick for weddings and all family gatherings. So if you've got a partner you need to convince before buying Collide 4, then this might be a useful trick. Now if I turn off the Hilbert transform network, now you're just getting ring modulation. So you can hear, with ring modulation what happens is that you get sum and difference frequencies. So you get, if you, and I'm just gonna, because you have no idea what I'm saying otherwise. If you just multiply 2 signals with each other, what you actually get is the sum between the 2 frequencies and the difference between the 2 frequencies. So you get these 2 spikes, let's say, on the spectrum. With frequency shifting, the cool thing what happens is that you still have those 2 in one channel, you have those 2 in the other channel, but there's a phase difference. And if you then sum them, these 2 spectra, you sum them or you take the difference of them, one of these 2 peaks gets cancelled out. So it's phase cancellation. And if the lower one gets cancelled out and only the upper one remains, then you get shifting up. If the lower one remains and the upper one is cancelled out, then you get shifting down. And that's exactly what happens in Collide 4. And then if I go back here, you get shifting up, 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 up. And I can shift to 0 with the oscillator symmetry control as well, like this. And then need to enable the Hilbert transform, that's better. So once the Hilbert transform switch is enabled, that's when you get this cancellation of one of the 2. And otherwise you just have, if we go back to the diagram. So just to clarify, you have this switch here. X is Y means that X is Y. These are the same. So this Hilbert transform network is bypassed. Switches are in this position. Once you enable this switch, setting it to delta 90, then this signal from our input section, this monitor signal, goes through this network. You take these 2 outputs, and that's when you have the difference between X and Y. And that's when you get this cancellation of one of the 2, and that's when you get frequency shifting. So this top right switch is the frequency shifting enable switch. So again, ring modulation, and now we have frequency shifting. We can go up, can go down like this. And then if we go down, for example, and I take the other outputs, now it goes up. So if the difference output gives you shifting in one direction, then the sum output will give you shifting in the other direction. In other words, we have stereo frequency shifting down in one ear and up in the other. So if you're not confused yet, then you're definitely confused now. But let me assure you that if you put a drum loop through this, or really like anything, especially with some complexity, you can do all of this processing in the input section, and then you add the frequency shifting on top. Collide 4 becomes a monster of signal processing and affecting, and you got the filters on the time constant filter on the output as well. So it's really much more than a synth voice or a complex oscillator. The processing capabilities are so nice. Why do I use the microphone to demonstrate the frequency shifting? It's cool, and also it's a really good way. It has to do with how, as humans, we are very much attuned to the voice, to the human voice. So once you start to do processing on that, you very clearly hear like something is changed about the sound. And what does frequency shifting actually do? Well, it shifts the entire spectrum of a sound up or down. So it's different from pitch shifting. That's a distinct effect where you would keep the harmonic structure intact by multiplying all of the frequencies by a ratio. In frequency shifting, if you have a couple of frequencies that have nice harmonic ratios, you shift them all by adding or subtracting a certain amount of hertz from them. Those nice harmonic ratios no longer exist between them, and that's why everything starts to sound really weird and alien and interesting. So that's a frequency shifting. And then, if we have another look at the diagram, we've covered most of Collide 4's circuitry here. But on the bottom, we have the output section, sum and difference. We just use those for the frequency shifting. We also have something called a polar converter with magnitude and phase. And now we're going deep into physics land because this has to do with how a quadrature lock-in amplifier works. And really the mathematical details, if you're interested in those, it's in the manual. I'm not gonna go deep into that. That's gonna be, and if you want to have like a deep mathematics follow-up, we can do that, but you might have to invite a mathematics professor from the local university for that. But the magnitude and phase, well, remember that a lock-in amplifier is at its origin a measurement instrument. So what you want to, if you're a physicist, what you want to know is how strong is the signal I'm measuring, what is its magnitude, and also the phase is a natural result of that. So on a classic lock-in amplifier, you have a process that's phase dependent. You have a knob, a phase knob, you adjust, and you try to find the point where you get the highest response because your experiment might be causing some phase shifts. So you have to compensate for that with the phase shifter in the module. Collide 4 does not have that phase adjustment. Instead, it has the sine and the cosine channels. And it turns out that using some mathematics, you can then calculate magnitude and phase from that. It's trigonometry. And that's what happens in this polar converter. So this is a trigonometric analog computer built into Collide 4, calculating a magnitude parameter, which is always a positive value, out of this x prime and y prime. There's square roots involved. That's as far as I'll go. And the polar converter does the arctangent between those two, also using analog computing. So the phase output is especially special because the voltage on this output does not depend on how strong these two are, but the ratio between them. What does that mean in practice? This phase output has a life of its own. It can swing anywhere from -10 to +10 volts, even if the other outputs are quiet, because it's always trying to calculate the phase between them. So be careful with that one. Now, the magnitude output, to go back to that one, The magnitude output is cool in a musical practical sense because it does this kind of rectification thing. So let's listen to that. And what I'm gonna do here is actually use more 4. Quickly set it up as a cross spanner. And then I'll take these two and then let's see. Oh yeah, okay. So we've got magnitude here, and that's the X prime output ring modulation, again, of these two oscillators. And the magnitude output, you will notice, is it appears to be 1 octave higher because it has this frequency rectification thing going on. So a sine wave gets turned into this. Oh, we lost the beamer. All right. So it creates this this bunny hop waveform, for lack of a better word, which is 1 octave higher. But also because you get this peak in it, you get some more harmonics. And it was interesting to realize that when I was working on Collide 4 and Hainbach got the first prototype in, I just added this magnitude and phase output out of pure completionism because I wanted this to be a true lock-in amplifier. And if you look at a modern lock-in amplifier, which is basically a Windows computer disguised as an instrument, it has a little screen with a digital readout that says magnitude and phase. So I was like, okay, good, we're making a modern analog quadrature lock-in amplifier, which is a world first, as far as I know. So let's also give it magnitude and phase like you would find on a real instrument. And then when it came into Hainbach's hands, he said that it's interesting that this magnitude output sounds quite close to a lot of the vintage units he has, because you get these extra harmonics. So let's, for example, return to our little ping patch from the beginning. And we can, let's see. And it should be pinging now. So we've got, again, filter pings going on, but this time we're listening to the ring modulated output. Or rather, this is the ring modulated output. And of course, we can play with the resonance. Already very nice tones in there. If we return to the magnitudes, it's got some very different textures. Definitely more harmonics in there. But we lose that low end because we have that rectification effect going on. So we can actually make a blend between them. In this case, using more 4 just as a crossfader. And get these different variations in between. So yeah, just a quick patching tip there on how to use the magnitudes output. Now, if you want to listen to the phase outputs, let's do that. I'm gonna turn down the speakers because it's pretty serious. So we're still pinging the filter, and this phase output is constantly trying to calculate the phase difference between X prime and Y prime. And now I'm gonna play with the parameters a bit. Especially if you have some frequency beating there, it really picks it out very nice. It's a little bit like, imagine if Stockhausen had a super saw synthesizer. Kind of how I imagine it would sound. And it's always trying to calculate. So if I turn down the resonance, and you get very weak signals now. So I'm just gonna take direct outputs, the Y prime, for example, very weak. But if we listen directly to the phase output, it just keeps trying to do these calculations. So you hear it like being starved of information to do the calculations on, until I turn on the resonance, turn up the resonance again. You hear it breaking up. And of course, you can still play with the Hilbert transform network switch, which is going to change the information feeding our analog computing. And we get different results again. And you can still do this panning trick I did earlier. So we are using more 4 here next to Collide 4. Take different outputs like this, and I'm just gonna set it up as a scanner between different outputs of Collide 4, and I'll take the. I'm gonna need a little bit more signal than that. So Collide 4 does not always have to sound like some supernova exploding. But one thing I really like is scanning through these different outputs. We can create some rather crisp filter pings. And of course, some tuning is involved. Let's throw the phase in there. You can use a time constant as well. So you can do some interesting, and I'll use another output that's a bit louder. Or we can frequency shifts, and then I'll take another one of these sum difference outputs. And now actually we just have some static sine waves. 4 different sounds we can go between. And we can even modulate that on more 4, adding some modulation from orbit 3. And you can create these very gentle soundscapes. And of course, there's always the option of turning up the gain again. All right, little demo there. And there's one more thing before I forget to mention. If you go back to the diagram, make sure I don't forget. The X, Y, I, and Q inputs. These are dedicated inputs to the ring modulators. So we see these here on the bottom. So you can actually override all of this stuff that's going on and use these ring modulators on their own, ring modulator plus filter, in your patching. So as I said earlier, all of these building blocks, you can create massive patches, and you can use the different parts of Collide 4 as functions within those patches. Yeah, I think that's the module mostly covered. There's, I'm sure, stuff I forgot because it is a very deep, capable module. Difficult to do completely justice in a little presentation like this, so definitely have a look online as well. So we have a lot of videos. We have a massive user manual, which even includes all of the technicalities if you're interested in that. And for the rest, yeah, feel free to ask any questions if you have any questions. Yeah.
For the kind of bandpass input filter section,
yeah.
Did you guys go about like modeling a vintage lock-in amplifiers kind of filter topology, or did you design your own kind of sort of more modern?
Good question. And I didn't really touch on that, but one of the tenets of the Joranalogue brand is that we don't clone stuff. So we don't clone like vintage circuitry. And a lot of what Collide 4 is capable of could not be capable in the past. There's a reason why these huge vintage units are that big, and also why they're not, why they're not so fully featured, and that's because the technology didn't exist. So to answer your question, no, this is all completely new circuitry using analog innovations that weren't possible in the past. But one of the interesting things was that when I was quite early in the development of Collide 4, and I got some guidance from Hainbach on how his favorite vintage unit works and how the architecture is like. And then we found quite quickly that you don't need to clone the old circuits to get all of these tones you also find in the vintage stuff. So the magic is really in the architecture and the way you use it, rather than know, capacitors with funny colors on them or something, or some potted module. Or and that's really a revelation for me, that you don't have to clone this old stuff to make it sound good. That's not where the magic lies. And that's really, that's also why Collide 4 fits so perfectly within the rest of the series, because modern analog is really what Joranalogue is about, and showing what's possible with modern analog. And not everything needs to be a clone of something from 50 years ago. There's so much left to explore, so much not done, not tried yet, that I think it's almost a disservice to the capabilities of analog synthesis, to not, as a human species, that we would not explore this and instead keep going like, yeah, okay, that's a cool filter, you know, let's sweep that cool filter we've all heard 50 years. I'm going on a rant. Anyway, to answer your question, no cloning, all original analog circuitry, and there's more than 600 parts, I believe, if I'm not wrong, in Collide 4. Yeah, so it's 20 HP module. Gets a little bit warm, but not too bad. It does a lot, and remember that these vintage units are this big and weigh 20 kilos. So actually, not bad. And Hainbach manages to take 4 of them on the road. So that's pretty capable setup, I think. Yeah.
This is a collaboration design.
Yeah.
As a designer, did you find that a challenge? Because you normally work to your own specification? And also, was there anything within Hainbach's specification that you couldn't do, or it didn't work as you expected?
It's a great question. The thing is that about collaborations, it's not something I ever really set out to do specifically, because it can be challenging, where you have different expectations and so on. And I've declined some things in the past. But when I got together with Stefan, with Hainbach, it was very clear that we had essentially the same vision, which is to bring this not only the practical idea of him being able to take his test equipment-based music on the roads, but also bringing this form of analog synthesis, this old new form of analog synthesis, to a wider audience. So it became clear very early that we had this shared vision, and then it all kind of made perfect sense as a collaboration, as a module within the Joranalogue series, as a concept for a product. So no, there was actually no challenge at all, and I think that's quite rare as far as collaborations go. But I think also the end result is something that reflects the. I said we were going to synergize, so the synergy that is Collide 4. All right. Any other questions? No, I think that'll be it. All right. Well, thanks again.